In 1961, miners in Morocco blasted through rock and found a human skull. They assumed it was recent, maybe a few thousand years old. They tossed it in a box and kept digging. That skull sat mislabeled in a museum drawer for over 50 years. When scientists finally re-examined it in 2017, using updated thermoluminescence dating on the burnt flint tools found beside it, they got a number that stopped the lab cold. 315,000 years old. Not 40,000, not 200,000, 315,000. That single number didn't just push back human origins, it demolished the map entirely. And the strangest part? It wasn't found in East Africa. The place we'd been told for a century was the birthplace of our species. It was found in Morocco, a place nobody was looking. Here's what that number actually means. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story was clean and certain. Homo sapiens emerged around 200,000 years ago in East Africa, specifically in the Great Rift Valley of Ethiopia. That was the birthplace. That was the origin point. Every textbook, every documentary, every museum exhibit was built on that foundation. Jebel Irhoud didn't just add 100,000 years to the timeline. It moved the starting line to a completely different place. Now, I want to plant 3 questions in your head before we go any further, because we're going to answer all 3. And the third one is the one that should genuinely disturb you. First, if our species is 100,000 years older than we thought, what were we doing for that missing centuries? Second, the skull has a modern face, but an ancient brain case. What does that mean? And which part of you evolved first? And third, there's a second cave, in Greece, that nobody talks about. And what's inside it changes the story of human intelligence more than the Moroccan skull does. We'll get to all of it. Stop. Before we go any further, I need you to understand what these fossils physically look like. Because when researchers describe them, they use a word that doesn't appear often in paleoanthropology: mosaic. The Jebel Irhoud specimens show a face that falls within the variation of humans living today. Modern cheekbones, a flat, forward-facing brow, a jaw that wouldn't look strange on the street. But from the back of the skull, the neurocranium, the housing for the brain, the shape is elongated, archaic. It looks more like a Neanderthal than a person. Jean-Jacques Hublin of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig described them as the earliest representatives of a still evolving Homo sapiens lineage, not the finished product, the draft. So what we have is a face that became us before the brain did. Think about what that means. The part of you that other people recognize as human, the face you present to the world, was already complete 315,000 years ago. The part that thinks, the part generating the thoughts you're having right now as you watch this, that came later, much later, and we still don't fully understand why those two things evolved on different schedules. Here's the full story of how this happened. And it's more embarrassing for science than most textbooks admit. When the first skull was found at Jebel Irhoud in 1961, it was handed to a French paleontologist named Georges Henouchi. He examined it and declared it to be about 40,000 years old, a late archaic human, probably a North African version of Neanderthal. Case closed. The skull was sent to Paris, filed, largely forgotten. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers occasionally revisited the site and began redating the materials. The number came back as somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years old. Still puzzling, still didn't fit anywhere cleanly, still ignored by the mainstream. Here's the problem. At 160,000 years old, The Jebel Irhoud skull would be younger than the oldest accepted Homo sapiens fossils from Ethiopia, so it got categorized as a regional variant, an evolutionary dead end, and the textbooks stayed the same. Then in 2007, a new team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin reopened the site. They found new fossils, 5 individuals this time, skull fragments, jaw bones, a child's teeth, and alongside them, 500 stone tools made using Levallois technique. In 2017, using thermoluminescence dating on flint tools heated in ancient fires, they got the definitive number, 315,000 years, plus or minus 34,000. Hublin described the moment in an interview. The number came back, and the team sat in silence, because it meant everything they had built the origin story on was wrong. Here's what the Jebel Irhoud discovery actually proved, and it's bigger than a number. For decades, the out of East Africa model positioned the Great Rift Valley, Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, as a kind of Eden, the single point of origin. Every other part of Africa was a periphery. Morocco wasn't in the conversation at all. But Hublin's team didn't just find fossils. They found stone tools manufactured using a technique called Levallois, a method previously associated with cognitively modern humans that requires planning multiple steps ahead. You don't make a Levallois flake by accident. You have to visualize the finished form inside the raw stone before you strike it. These tools were distributed across North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Africa, all at roughly the same time. What that suggests is a Pan-African model of human emergence. Not a single birthplace, not one Eden, but a continent-wide process with populations in contact across vast distances, sharing technology, interbreeding, evolving together. We didn't come from one place. We came from everywhere at once, and that reframing from a single point of origin to a continental emergence is one of the most fundamental shifts in the science of human origins since Darwin. But it still doesn't answer the question I planted earlier. Which part of you evolved first, and why does the answer matter? We're almost there. You're still here. Good. Because what I'm about to tell you is the part of this story that every documentary leads with the number and then skips. The face. Specifically, what it means that the face was modern before the brain was. This is the part that changes how you understand your own evolution. Here's what the neuroscience and paleoanthropology communities have been quietly wrestling with since 2017. The face of the Jebel Irhoud specimens, the part you'd recognize as human, was already in its modern form 315,000 years ago. Flat, forward-facing, high cheekbones, retracted brow. The brain, specifically the globular, rounded shape of the modern human neurocranium that houses the prefrontal cortex, the temporal lobes, the architecture for language, planning, and abstract thought, didn't reach its modern form until somewhere between 100,000 and 35,000 years ago. That's a gap of at least 200,000 years. 200,000 years of looking human before fully thinking human. The significance isn't just academic. It means that social recognition, the ability to read a face, to identify group members, to signal emotion and intention, was evolutionarily prioritized before abstract cognition. We became socially legible before we became intellectually modern. Put more bluntly, we learned to read each other's faces before we learned to plan a hunt, before we built tools, before we made art, before we told stories. The face came first, because in a world of predators and competing groups, being recognized as one of us, instantly, at a distance, may have been the single most important survival advantage available. Not a bigger brain, a readable face. We'll come back to why that matters for everything that came after. But first, I promised you a second cave, one that shouldn't exist at all. Stop. Take everything you know about the earliest human structures. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 11,500 years old, the oldest known temple. Stonehenge, roughly 5,000 years old. The pyramids at Giza, 4,500 years old. Now throw all of that away. Because in a cave in central Greece, 3 kilometers from the famous Meteora monastery formations, cut into a limestone cliff above the Thessalian plain, there is a wall built from stones bound with clay mortar. 23,000 years old, dated by optically stimulated luminescence, a technique that measures the accumulated radiation dose in mineral grains since they were last exposed to heat or light, giving a precise date of when the stones were set. 23,000 years old, 3 times older than the oldest pyramid, 16,000 years before Göbekli Tepe. It's still standing. Theopetra Cave sits on the slopes of a limestone hill overlooking the village of the same name in Thessaly, central Greece. Excavations began in 1987 under archaeologist Dr. Catherine Kyparisi Apostolica of the Greek Ephorate of Paleoanthropology and Speleology. She has been working the site for nearly 4 decades. What she found inside was a continuous sedimentary record spanning 130,000 years, the longest unbroken archaeological sequence of any excavated site in Greece. 6 meters deep, layer after layer after layer. At the deepest levels, evidence of Neanderthal occupation. Higher up, the transition to modern humans. Then hunter-gatherers. Then early farmers. The entire story of human cognitive and cultural development compressed into a single cave floor. But the wall is the thing, built during the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, when ice sheets covered most of northern Europe and temperatures had dropped up to 15 degrees Celsius below today's baseline. The wall was constructed to partially seal the cave's 17-meter-wide entrance. It reduced the opening to approximately 1 meter in width. The stones were selected, transported, shaped, and bound with clay mortar. They weren't stacked at random. The construction demonstrates what Dr. Kyparisi Apostolica described in her 2026 publication as an early form of architectural planning, evidence that Upper Paleolithic humans were, in her words, capable of more complex environmental modifications than previously assumed. They didn't just shelter in caves. They engineered them. Around 20,000 years before the oldest pyramid, before writing, before farming, before any of the markers we traditionally use to define civilization, they were already building. Remember the miners, 1961, Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, blasting through rock for barite ore. They found a skull and didn't know what it was. Here's what I didn't tell you then. They almost didn't find it at all. The skull was 2 meters below the surface, fused into the rock. If the blast had been slightly larger, it would have been dust. Everything we now know, gone. Here's what these 2 caves taken together actually reveal. Not just that we're older than we thought, not just that we built things earlier than we thought, but that the story we tell about human origins, the tidy narrative of a single birthplace, a linear progression, a moment of ignition, was always wrong. Human emergence was messy, continental, simultaneous. Populations spread across a continent, in contact and out of contact, interbreeding and diverging, evolving the face in one place and the brain in another, building a wall in Greece while a different branch was making Levallois tools in Morocco. We didn't become human in one place at one time. We became human everywhere, slowly, together. And that wall in Theopetra, that modest stack of stones bound with clay, built to keep the wind out, built by people whose names we will never know. That wall is still standing. After 23,000 years of ice ages and civilizations and wars and everything that came after. Still standing because that is what humans do. We don't just survive the conditions we're given. We modify them. We have always modified them. The cave that shouldn't exist was built by people who had no reason to believe anyone would ever find it or care. They built it anyway. That instinct to build, to plan, to modify the world for the people who come after you is not a modern invention, and it lives in you. If this changed how you think about where you came from, I want you to do one thing: not subscribe, not yet. I want you to think about something you've built or modified or changed, anything you've made better for someone who comes after you, a note, a repair, a habit you passed on. Because that impulse to plan ahead, to modify your environment for future occupants, is exactly what the people of Theopetra were doing 23,000 years ago. You are not the end of a story that started in East Africa 300,000 years ago. You are the latest iteration of something that has been building since before anyone thought we could. If you want to keep going, the next video is right there. I think it might be the most important one I've made. I'll see you there.